All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a request. Someone wants a crash course in ancient ethical theory,
Mm,
and specifically for explaining these ideas to a fellow philosopher. So
yeah.
pretty ambitious stuff, but
Yeah.
that's what we're here for, right?
Okay.
The listener even sent us the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the topic.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's a beast,
Yeah.
but don't worry, we'll break it down.
Yeah. It's easy to get lost in all the academic jargon,
Right.
even for, someone who's been doing philosophy for a while.
For sure.
But these ancient thinkers were really grappling with questions that are still relevant to us today.
Yeah.
What does it mean to live a good life? What is virtue?
Yeah.
How do we achieve it?
Exactly. And they were so obsessed with happiness,
Yeah.
but not just like fleeting happiness.
Right.
They called it eudaimonia.
Mm.
It's more like flourishing, living up to your full potential.
Yeah, exactly.
And they believe the soul played a huge role in all of this.
Right. The soul was really central to their thinking. Not necessarily, in like a religious sense,
Right.
but more as like the core of our, thoughts, emotions, character.
Hmm.
And they really believed that cultivating a virtuous soul
Yeah.
was the key to a good life.
Okay, so where do we even begin? The
Right.
Stanford Encyclopedia mentions this concept of arete,
Mm.
which means excellence, but it's not just about being like morally good, right?
Exactly. Not at all. It applies to anything.
Yeah, a good knife cuts.
Right.
Well, a good horse runs fast,
Right.
but what makes a good human?
Ooh.
That's the question they were trying to figure out.
right.
And they believed that humans, like everything else, have a specific function or purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And our arete for humans was about fulfilling that purpose.
Okay, so archete is about being good at being human.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Right.
Stanford Encyclopedia gives us these contrasting examples.
Okay.
The warrior chieftain
Hmm.
versus the statesman.
Yeah.
One is about strength and conquest. The other is about wisdom and justice. I think that's a perfect place to start with your philosopher friends.
Yeah.
Because it shows how different societies might value different traits.
Mm-hmm.
Even in ancient Greece, there was no one answer
Right.
to what made a human excellent intelligent.
It's interesting, though, because even with those different ideals,
Yeah,
they all seem to agree that moral virtues were important.
right.
Courage, justice, moderation, piety.
Yeah.
These kept coming up.
Absolutely. But here's where it gets tricky.
Okay.
They didn't always see a direct link between those moral virtues and our piety.
Okay.
Like a warrior society might say courage is the most important,
Right.
even if it leads to injustice.
So you could be courageous and still not be a good person.
Yeah, that's what they're suggesting.
That seems a little counterintuitive.
I think it would lead to some good discussion, though,
Yeah, for sure.
because it challenges how we think about what's good today.
Right.
And remember, these thinkers were trying to understand
Right.
what virtue, even how we develop it and how it all connects to living a good life.
Totally.
And they weren't afraid to push the boundary
No, they went
of conventional thinking.
Okay, so our brete is about fulfilling our purpose as humans.
Yeah,
That involves moral virtues, but it's not always so clear-cut.
right,
And then there's this whole concept of eudaimonia,
right.
which we usually translate as happiness, but it's so much deeper than that.
Mm-hmm.
The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about it as of flourishing, living well, reaching your potential.
And that's where the discussion gets really interesting. Like, think about asking your colleagues,
Mm-hmm.
can you truly flourish, achieve eudaimonia without being morally good? Would a life of success and status really be fulfilling if it lacked virtue?
That's a great question. It really makes you think about what truly matters.
Right?
And this brings us back to the soul.
Yes.
The ancients saw it as like the home of virtue, the inner workings of a person.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just concerned with outward actions,
Yeah.
but the kind of person you were on the inside.
Exactly. A big contrast with a lot of modern ethics,
Right.
which focuses on rules and actions.
Yeah.
The ancients were convinced that inner transformation,
Yeah.
cultivating that virtuous soul, was the foundation for a truly good life.
So we've got these big ideas
Yeah.
are rite, eudaimonia, and the soul. These are the building blocks
Yeah.
of ancient ethical theory.
Absolutely.
And now it's time to see how these ideas play out in the philosophies of some specific thinkers.
Let's do it. Now, when it comes to explaining this stuff to another philosopher, you really can't skip Socrates.
Oh, sure.
He's like the ultimate example of virtue and the philosophical life.
Yeah, he's definitely a memorable figure willing to die for his beliefs. I mean, imagine bringing that up in your philosophy discussion.
Right.
It really highlights that whole commitment to justice.
Yeah, Socrates believed that harming your soul through injustice was far worse than anything physical.
Wow.
Like, for him, living a just life wasn't just a good idea. It was the only way to truly live well.
It's almost like he saw self-care as soul care. You know,
Right.
make your soul virtuous and you're taking care of yourself in the deepest way possible.
Exactly.
I wonder how your colleagues would react to that idea.
It's pretty radical,
Yeah.
especially today where self-care is all about, bubble baths and face masks.
Yeah, for sure.
Socrates is challenging us to look inward, to cultivate the qualities that truly matter.
And then there's his famous idea that virtue asks knowledge.
Right.
He thought if you really understood what was good,
Uh-huh.
you couldn't help but do it.
Yeah.
But haven't we all messed up even when we knew better?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the most debated things about Socrates,
Yeah.
this whole concept of akrasia, or weakness of will.
Right.
It's that we often do things we know we shouldn't, even when we have the choice to do something else.
So how would you explain this to another philosopher?
Okay.
Did Socrates just ignore this very human problem?
He didn't ignore it, but he definitely tried to explain it away.
Oh.
He said that true knowledge, the kind that leads to virtue,
Yeah.
that couldn't be overridden by just desires or temptations.
Mm-hmm.
If you really knew what was good, you wouldn't be swayed by those baser impulses.
So maybe the problem isn't weakness of will, it's a lack of true understanding.
Maybe.
Interesting.
And that raises another question, right? What does
Yeah.
it even mean to truly know something?
Right.
Is it just intellectual, or is there something deeper going on?
Yeah, I like that a lot.
That's definitely something you could explore with your colleagues.
For sure. And speaking of challenging conversations, let's move on to Plato.
Oh, right.
He was Socrates' student, and he took these ideas in some really fascinating directions.
Yeah, Plato built on what Socrates started,
Right.
but he also brings in his own unique perspective. He
Yeah.
really digs into the nature of morality itself.
Right.
Like, is justice truly desirable or just a tool for the powerful?
Right. In the Republic, he has Socrates debating guys like Thrasymachus and Callicles, who are basically saying morality is for suckers.
Right.
It's a pretty cynical view,
It is.
but it makes you think about power dynamics and social structures.
And you can imagine trying to explain this debate to people today.
Yeah,
It's super relevant to
what's
everything
that?
that's going on politically and socially.
absolutely.
Is justice really good in itself,
Yeah.
or just what the powerful decide it is?
So how did Plato, speaking through Socrates, counter these arguments?
Right.
The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions this analogy of the city and the soul.
Oh, yeah. This is one of Plato's most famous ideas.
Okay.
He argues that just like a well-functioning city needs different types of people. You've got
Mhm.
your rulers, your warriors, your producers.
Yeah.
The soul also has 3 parts.
Okay, so break it down for us. How do these parts of the soul connect to the city?
All right, so reason is like the rulers,
Mhm.
the part that thinks and plans and tries to figure things out.
Yeah.
It wants wisdom and knowledge to guide the soul towards what's truly good. Then you've got the spirited part. Sometimes it's associated with anger, but also the drive for honor.
Right.
Like the warriors defending what's right.
Right.
And lastly, there are the appetites. Those basic desires for food, drink, pleasure.
Uh-huh.
Like the producers providing for our basic needs.
So the soul is like a little society
Yeah.
with all these different groups fighting for control.
Exactly.
So how does all this connect to justice?
Well, for Plato, justice is all about harmony within the soul.
Okay.
Each part doing its job without overstepping.
Hmm.
When reason is in charge, guided by wisdom, the soul is balanced
Right.
and the individual acts justly.
But does a harmonious soul automatically mean you're good to others?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the real debate starts.
Yeah.
Plato thought a just person would naturally treat others justly.
Mm.
He saw a direct connection between inner harmony and how you act in the world.
Right.
But does it always work that way?
Yeah.
Something to think about.
For sure. And, of course, we can't talk about Plato without mentioning his theory of forms.
Right, those eternal, unchanging ideals
Yeah.
that represent the true essence of things.
It's one of his most famous ideas and definitely one of the most complex.
Absolutely. The forms are central to Plato's philosophy,
Mm.
and they're deeply connected to his concept of virtue.
Okay.
He believed that real knowledge, the kind that leads to virtue, involves understanding these forms.
So how do these forms connect to everyday virtue? Seems kind of abstract.
Yeah, and that's the tricky part.
Right.
And that's where your discussions with other philosophers could get really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Plato explores this connection in different ways throughout his work.
Mm-hmm.
In the Republic, he talks about imitating the forms,
Okay.
aligning our actions with these perfect ideals.
Yeah.
In the Phaedo, it's about detaching from the body and its desires
Okay.
to access pure knowledge of the forms.
Interesting.
And in the Symposium, he portrays eros, or yearning for beauty, as a force that drives us toward virtue, ultimately leading us to contemplate the form of beauty itself.
Wow, so many different angles.
Yeah.
It seems like Plato didn't want a simple answer,
He didn't.
but he clearly saw virtue as key to eudaimonia, that idea of flourishing and living well.
Yes, and even though he stressed the importance of virtue,
Mm-hmm.
he didn't always say how much other stuff mattered.
Right.
Like wealth, health, social status, all those things.
Yeah,
Is virtue enough for eudaimonia?
right.
Or do we need other things too?
That's a big question.
It's another area ripe for discussion.
It sounds like Plato was leaving plenty of room for debate.
He was.
And speaking of debate, let's bring in another heavy hitter, Aristotle. He was Plato's student, but he had his own very distinct take on ethics. Okay, so Aristotle, he was all about like bringing philosophy down to earth, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wanted to figure out how we can actually live good lives.
Right, not just theorize about it.
Yeah, Aristotle was really interested in how humans actually work in the real world.
Yeah.
He wasn't so focused on those abstract ideals like the forms.
Right.
He wanted to know, what does it mean to live well? What choices actually lead to eudaimonia, to flourishing?
So less about contemplating perfect forms and more about making good decisions in everyday life.
Exactly.
I like that. So what's his main takeaway here?
Well, Aristotle believed that happiness or eudaimonia wasn't just some passive state of bliss, you know?
Okay.
It's about actively doing things well,
Mm-hmm.
living in accordance with what makes us human
Okay.
and what sets us apart from animals,
Mm.
our ability to reason.
So living well means using our reason well.
Right.
But how does that translate into like making moral choices?
That's where his idea of the golden mean comes in.
Okay, I've heard of that.
He said that virtue is about finding the balance between two extremes.
Okay.
So take courage, for example.
Yeah.
It's the mean between cowardice, being too afraid, and recklessness, being too impulsive.
Right.
Moderation is the mean between overindulgence and being too strict with yourself.
Okay, so it's not about following a set of rules.
Not exactly.
It's more about finding that sweet spot in every situation.
Yeah, finding that balance.
How would you explain this to another philosopher?
Right.
It seems like you get pretty subjective, right?
That's a good point. And that's where Aristotle introduces the idea of practical wisdom, or phronesis.
Phronesis.
It's the ability to figure out the right thing to do in each specific situation.
Okay.
It's not just knowing the rules, but having good judgment.
So you need both theoretical knowledge and the practical skills to apply it.
Exactly.
I bet your philosopher friends would have a lot to say about how we actually develop phronesis.
Oh, definitely. It's a great question.
What would Aristotle say about that?
Well, he thought phronesis is something you develop through experience, through making choices and seeing what happens.
Makes sense.
It's a skill you hone over time, not something you just learn from a book.
Right.
He also said role models are important.
Oh, interesting.
Learning from people who already embody virtue.
So find a virtuous mentor and start making choices.
Basically.
I like it. Practical advice. But wait, wasn't Aristotle also really into contemplation?
He was.
Didn't he think that the philosopher's life, lost in thought, was the highest form of happiness?
Yeah, he did seem to suggest that.
So which is it, contemplation or action?
Right. It's a tough one.
How do you reconcile those two ideas?
Yeah.
It seems like a great topic for your philosophy discussions.
It definitely is. It's something Aristotle himself struggled with.
Yeah?
He saw the value in both the contemplative life and the active life,
Mm-hmm.
but it's hard to say which one he ultimately favored.
It's a debate that's still going on today.
For sure.
Wow, so much to think about. But we're not quite done with ancient ethical theory yet, right?
Oh.
We've got to at least mention a few other schools of thought,
Yeah, we can't leave him out.
like the Cynics, those
Mhm.
back-to-nature folks who rejected social norms. Imagine bringing them up in your discussions.
Right. That would shake things up.
Yeah, they'd be a wild card.
Think about Diogenes hanging out in his wine jar,
Yeah.
challenging everyone's ideas about the good life.
The Cynics thought true happiness came from aligning yourself with nature.
Yeah. Rejecting all that extra stuff, possession status.
Okay, then we have the Cyrenaics, who were all about pleasure,
Right.
Would they agree with Aristotle's golden mean?
Not really. The Cyrenaics thought immediate pleasure was the key.
Okay.
They wanted to enjoy the here and now without worrying too much about the future.
Right.
Virtue only mattered if it helped you get pleasure.
It's a pretty hedonistic approach.
Yeah.
I wonder what your more Stoic philosopher friends would think of that.
Speaking of the Stoics, they were like the opposite of the Cyrenaics.
Okay.
They took that idea of virtue being the only good to the extreme. They thought everything else, health, wealth, relationships, it didn't matter for true happiness.
So you could be happy while being tortured. That's a tough one.
It is a radical idea.
Yeah.
But they believed we can't control what happens to us,
Right.
but we can control our minds. By focusing on virtue, living in accordance with reason and nature, they thought we could reach a state of tranquility or apatheia.
Apatheia.
That's like being unfazed by the ups and downs of life.
That's some serious mental strength. I'm not sure I could do that.
It takes practice.
And finally, we have the skeptics who questioned if we can ever really know anything for sure,
Right.
including what's good or bad.
Yeah. How would you explain that one to a philosopher?
It's a tough one. It almost seems like it undermines the whole point of ethics.
Right. If we can't know what's good, how can we try to live good lives?
But the skeptics weren't saying nothing matters.
No, they weren't nihilists.
They just thought true peace of mind comes from accepting that we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. Letting go of that need for certainty.
It's an interesting perspective, especially today, when everyone wants a clear right answer.
Absolutely.
Wow, we've covered so much ground from Ide to eudaimonia,
I know, right?
from the soul to the forms, from the golden mean to skepticism.
We've been through a lot.
We've explored Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and a whole bunch of other ancient thinkers.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour of ancient ethics.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you plenty to talk about with your philosopher friends.
I hope so. Each of these thinkers offers a really unique perspective on how to live a good life.
And remember, these aren't just abstract theories.
Right.
They're invitations to think about some of the biggest questions we face.
Yeah.
What is virtue? How do we achieve happiness? What's our purpose?
Those are questions that have been around for centuries.
Yeah.
And they're just as relevant today as they were back in ancient Greece.
So as you dive into those discussions with your colleagues,
Yeah.
keep an open mind and challenge your own assumptions. And remember that the journey of philosophy is just as important as the answers we find.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought.
Right.
If you were designing a perfect society, which of these schools of thought would you borrow from the most? And why? Until next time, keep diving deep.